Our topic today, Saving Democracy, I think is a fitting tribute to honor our veterans. I also want to recognize you, our audience. Many of you are league members, either from the county or from other leagues in Maryland or other states. We're also pleased to have many others who are not members yet. If you're not a member of the league, we encourage you to join. The league is a nonpartisan, grassroots-oriented group. You've probably heard about our work on registering voters, promoting voting rights and fair elections, and hosting candidate forums. But we also help our members and the community understand what's happening in local and regional politics. We advocate on issues by contacting our elected officials, providing testimony, and through education and events like this one.
36 participants.
Currently, we are partnering with the National League to push Congress to pass legislation to end voter suppression. In the chat, we will put two links to find a local league. One will take you to the League of Women Voters Maryland site, where you can find information on a local league in Maryland. The other will take you to a site where you can find information on a league in your state. It's a really great organization, and we hope you will join us. Today, we are very pleased to have Professor Stephen Levitsky. He is the David Rockefeller Professor of Latin American Studies and Professor of Government at Harvard University. He is also director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard. He studies democracies around the world. His research focuses on democratization and authoritarianism, political policies.
What?
I know I registered. This is so odd.
Political parties and weak and informal institutions, with a focus on Latin America. He is co-author with Daniel Ziblatt of How Democracies Die, which was a New York Times bestseller and was published in 25 languages. He has written and edited 11 other books, including Transforming Labor-Based Parties in Latin America, Competitive Authoritarianism, Hybrid Regimes After the Cold War, and Social Revolution and Durable Authoritarianism in the Modern World. He and Daniel Ziblatt are currently working on a book on the rise of and reaction against multiracial democracy in the United States. Please welcome Professor Levitsky.
Hi, can you hear everyone? Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Thank you, Gail. And first of all, let me extend a really sincere thanks to the League of Women Voters for this invitation. I am a big fan of the work that you do. And I must say, I wish this were not the case, but never, at least in my lifetime, has the work that you guys are doing been more important. So keep up the good work. I also want to second Gail's terrific point that protecting democracy is really a fitting way to honor our brave veterans tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit about this new book that Daniel Ziblatt and I are trying to write. American democracy is at a crossroads. On the one hand, we stand on the brink of multiracial democracy, which is an unprecedented achievement. And on the other hand, we stand on the brink of democratic breakdown, facing the real possibility of a stolen election in 2024. Now, I'm going to argue that these two seemingly contradictory developments are really quite interrelated, that our current crisis is rooted in a reaction against multiracial democracy. I'm also going to argue that our Constitution has become part of the problem and that it may be trapping us into minority rule. So to begin, the United States is undergoing a transition to multiracial democracy. To quote our president, that is a BFD. By multiracial democracy, I mean a democracy in a racially diverse society in which basic rights, including the right to vote, freedom of speech, assembly, and association, are universally protected. In other words, the rights of individuals of all ethnic groups are protected equally. Now, the United States became a multiracial democracy on paper with the civil rights legislation of the 1960s. But even today, we fall at least somewhat short of it in practice. Black citizens on average live further from polling places and wait longer to vote than white citizens. They're more likely to be victims of police harassment and police violence. They're more likely to be incarcerated and for longer periods of time. Notwithstanding that shortcoming, or those important shortcomings, multiracial democracy has become both more real and more consequential over the last 50 years. It's more real because the enforcement of civil and voting rights has improved pretty dramatically. Civil and voting rights still get violated, but when violations occur, they're more likely to be publicly denounced and legally challenged. Rights violations are less socially, less politically acceptable than they were in the past. Multiracial democracies become more consequential, of course, because America has grown so much more diverse. Whereas whites were an overwhelming 84% of the population 50 years ago, they're now just over half the population. Diversity is everywhere, from our television screens to our neighborhoods to our schools. Now, movement towards a real multiracial democracy is evident in many parts of our political system. Take Congress. Between 1980 and 2020, the last 40 years, the number of African Americans in Congress, the Senate and the House, increased from 19 to 64. The number of Hispanic and Latino members of Congress increased from 9 in 1980 to 51 today. The number of Asian American members of Congress increased from 6 to 18. Overall, the number of non-white members of Congress has nearly tripled since 1990, for 30 years. Movement towards multiracial democracy can also be seen in public opinion. For the first time, a solid, consistent majority of Americans embraces racial diversity and supports policies that enforce racial equality. In 1958, 4% of Americans approved of interracial marriage. 4% of Americans approved of interracial marriage. Today, 90%, between 90 and 95% of Americans approve of interracial marriage. In 1980, not that long ago, a majority of Americans opposed laws to ban discrimination in home sales. Today, 80% of Americans support such laws. In the 1990s, a solid majority of Americans opposed affirmative action. Today, Gallup consistently finds that 60% of Americans support affirmative action. Today, roughly 60 to 65% of Americans say that the growing diversity of our society makes America a better place to live. Now, these numbers reflect two trends. One is the growing presence of non-whites in our population, and the other is the increasing racial liberalism among part of the white population. This coalition of non-whites and racially liberal whites has given rise to a new multiracial Democratic majority. This is the majority that elected Barack Obama president. It's the majority that made Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff the first Black and Jewish senators ever elected from the state of Georgia on January 5th of this year. I want to emphasize this multiracial Democratic majority is entirely new. It is a 21st century phenomenon. It is only in the last couple of decades that a solid majority of Americans has embraced both racial diversity and racial equality. But if the January 5th election in Georgia gave us a glimpse of a possible multiracial Democratic future, the events of the following day, January 6th, suggested a much darker future, one that was almost unimaginable, at least for many of us, a few years ago. America's transition to multiracial democracy, our ability to make it those final 10 yards to a truly multiracial democracy, confronts two serious challenges today: a powerful authoritarian reaction against it, and a constitution that leaves us prone to minority rule. And I want to take each of these challenges in turn. So the first challenge is the Republican Party's authoritarian turn, the authoritarian reaction to multiracial democracy. This is something that Daniel and I failed to anticipate when we wrote How Democracies Die. We, just 4 years ago, when we wrote How Democracies Die, blamed the Republican Party for enabling the rise of Trump, but we did not view the party as an authoritarian party because most Republican leaders seem to be committed to playing by democratic rules of the game. I can no longer say that that is the case. Back in the 1970s, the political scientist Juan Linz, a Spanish political scientist, developed a set of guidelines for what he called loyal Democrats, or politicians who are committed to democracy. He was a little long-winded, so we condensed his guidelines into three basic principles for politicians who are committed to democracy. First, and these are very basic, democratic politicians must seek and retain power exclusively by democratic means. That means playing by democratic rules, it means accepting defeat, and it means leaving power unconditionally after losing elections. Democracy cannot survive if losers do not accept defeat. Second, democratic politicians must unambiguously reject the use of violence in pursuit of their political goals. And third, democratic politicians must break completely with anti-democratic extremism. That means publicly denouncing anti-democratic behavior, even among your allies and supporters. It means expelling anti-democratic elements from your ranks. And it means joining forces when necessary with ideological rivals to isolate and defeat anti-democratic extremism. When one looks at earlier democratic breakdowns across history in countries like Spain and Germany in the 1930s, or South America in the 1960s and 70s, one thing is crystal clear in almost every one of these cases. When mainstream politicians tolerate or condone violence or other forms of anti-democratic behavior from their supporters, from their allies, democracy is in trouble. When mainstream politicians tolerate or condone violence or anti-democratic behavior, democracy is in trouble. Between November 2020 and January 2021, Republican leaders violated all three of the principles that I just laid out. For the first time in the history of the United States, a sitting president refused to accept defeat and attempted to overturn an election. But rather than oppose what was in effect a presidential coup attempt, Republican leaders enabled the coup attempt by refusing to publicly acknowledge Trump's defeat. As of December 16, 2021, 6 weeks after the election, only 25 Republican members of Congress had acknowledged Joe Biden's victory. 200 of them had not. And of course, nearly 2/3 of House Republicans voted against certification of Biden's victory. In addition, leading Republicans have refused to break with the extremist forces behind the January 6th assault on the Capitol. The January 6th insurrection was organized by extremist militia groups, and many politicians, including the president, incited the attack. And yet Republican leaders refused to break either with Trump or with any other political figure implicated in the violence. They refused to impeach Trump. They blocked the creation of an independent commission to investigate the January 6th insurrection. And crucially, tellingly, they punished Republicans who defended democracy after January 6th. Republicans who either resisted Trump's effort to steal the election or who voted for Trump's impeachment were purged or censored by their local Republican party. And at the same time that those who stood up for democracy were punished by their party, Republicans who endorsed violence were rewarded. Marjorie Taylor Greene, who backed calls for the execution of Democratic Party leaders on social media, raised record-breaking sums of money in the aftermath of the January 6th attack. Congressman Mo Brooks, who helped to incite the January 6th insurrection, became a frontrunner for the U.S. Senate. That's a promotion. And Donald Trump, of course, has not only been protected by the Republican Party, but he's been embraced by it. Nearly all leading Republicans, including Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, say they will support Donald Trump in 2024, despite a coup attempt. So between November 2020 and January 2021, the bulk of the Republican Party refused to accept defeat, refused to denounce violence, and refused to break with anti-democratic extremists, including a president who had openly attempted a coup. These are unambiguous signs of a party that's no longer committed to democracy. It is hard to sustain a democracy when one of two major parties is no longer committed to it. In fact, I think, as I mentioned at the outset, that there is a decent chance that the Republicans will try to steal the 2024 election. Dan and I argued in How Democracies Die that our constitutional system relies pretty heavily on forbearance, whether it is the filibuster, impeachment, judicial nominations. our system, our pretty complicated system of checks and balances, only works when politicians on both sides of the aisle deploy their institutional prerogatives, deploy their power with restraint. In other words, they do not use the letter of the law to subvert the spirit of the law. They don't engage in what we call, following Mark Tushnet, constitutional hardball. Constitutional hardball is using the letter of the law to subvert the spirit of the law. When democracies die in the 21st century, they usually die at the hand of constitutional hardball. Democracies' assassins today, unlike the 1970s, are not generals. They're not armed revolutionaries. They're politicians like Chavez, Putin, Orban, Erdogan, who eviscerate democracy's substance behind a veneer of legality and constitutionality. In other words, they use the letter of the law to subvert its spirit. Now, how democracies died pointed to a troubling rise in constitutional hardball in the United States, even before the rise of Trump. For example, we pointed to the Senate's 2016 decision not to allow President Obama to fill the Supreme Court vacancy created by the death of Justice Scalia. That move was entirely legal, but in effect, it allowed Republicans to steal a Supreme Court seat. We did not, 4 years ago, consider the possibility that Republicans would use constitutional hardball to steal an election, but we should have. It is pretty easy to use the letter of the law to subvert an election in the United States. Think about the vote counting process. Election officials can legally throw out ballots, toss out ballots based on minor technicality, like failing it to fill in the entire oval on your ballot, or not having a perfect signature match on your absentee ballot form. That kind of petty ballot disqualification conforms to the letter of the law. But of course, it is profoundly anti-democratic because you are annulling people's votes. And if petty ballot disqualification is carried out unevenly, so that many ballots are disqualified in one party's stronghold, but they're not disqualified in another party's stronghold, that can turn an election. Republican officials across many parts of the country are laying the legal and administrative groundwork to engage in electoral hardball. Republican state legislatures have passed more than 24 bills aimed at facilitating exactly this, including in battleground states like Georgia, Texas, Florida, and Arizona. These measures will allow state legislatures or state election boards to either sideline or override local election administrations in Democratic strongholds. It will allow them, for example, to purge voter rolls and manipulate the number and location of polling places in Democratic strongholds. It would allow Republican officials to use minor technicalities to throw out ballots in Democratic strongholds. And in addition, several new laws impose criminal penalties on local election officials who were found or deemed to violate election procedure. That will enable statewide Republican officials to use the threat of criminal prosecution to compel local officials to engage in petty ballot disqualification. Again, throwing out thousands and thousands of ballots in rival strongholds is profoundly anti-democratic, but it is technically legal. And Republicans in several states now have the legal tools to enforce such practices. So the vote counting process is one place where hardball can be used. Hardball tactics can also be used later on in the Electoral College. As you probably know by now, the 1887 Electoral Account Act, and I didn't know anything about this even 2 years ago, allows state legislatures to send alternate slates of electors to the Electoral College in the event of a failed election. Now, that clause in 1887 was created with the intention of covering natural disasters, a hurricane or a tornado that prevents the election from happening. But state legislatures can use, for example, accusations of fraud to declare a failed election in their state. In other words, Republican legislatures could dispute statewide results and send rival slates of electors to the Electoral College. That would potentially throw the election into the House, where state delegations, not individual House members, elect the president. Republicans will almost certainly control a majority of state delegations, and they will almost certainly back their candidate, no matter who actually wins the election. There's a parallel here to what happened with the Supreme Court in 2016. Prior to 2016, it was almost unthinkable that an opposition-controlled Senate would simply refuse to allow the President of the United States to fill a Supreme Court seat. Nothing of the sort had occurred since 1866. And yet Republicans did the unthinkable. They stole a Supreme Court seat. And because the move was entirely legal, there was nothing Democrats could do about it. A similar process could unfold in 2024. Just as it was possible to legally steal a Supreme Court seat, it is possible to legally overturn a close election result. And there may be little, at least constitutionally, that Democrats can do about it. The 2020 election may have been a dress rehearsal for what is to come. Republican politicians learned two important things in the aftermath of the 2020 election. First of all, they learned that the electoral system creates a plethora of opportunities for hardball, a plethora of opportunities to legally overturn election results. Trump failed miserably at this in 2020, but his efforts to overturn the results revealed how it can be done. They exposed the sort of soft underbelly of American elections. The other thing Republicans learned in 2020 was that they would not be punished by voters for attempting to overturn an election. In fact, they learned that such efforts would be rewarded by Republican voters, by Republican activists, by state and local parties, and by many donors. But why the hell is this happening? Why is this happening? Democracy requires that parties know how to lose. If a party that is big enough to win elections cannot accept defeat, democracy is in trouble. Now, the Republican Party has been routinely accepting defeat for 150 years. Why would a mainstream party like the Republicans suddenly lose the ability to lose? Arguably, for parties to be able to accept defeat, for us to expect parties to accept defeat, two basic conditions have to hold. First of all, parties have to believe that they stand a chance to win again in the future. And second, the stakes have to be reasonably low. In other words, parties have to believe that losing will not bring ruinous consequences. When politicians fear that they're not going to be able to win future elections, or when they or their constituents believe that defeat will bring catastrophe, then the stakes of an election rise. Politicians' time horizons narrow, and they're tempted to throw tomorrow to the wind in order to play at any cost, win at any cost today. In other words, it is outsized fear of losing that leads parties to play dirty. Daniel, my co-author, found this dynamic in his research on 19th century German conservatives. German conservatives were terrified at the prospect of expanding the suburbs. For them, giving workers the right to vote meant not only their electoral defeat, but the demise of the entire aristocratic order. Unable to win free elections and unwilling to lose them, the conservatives in Germany played dirty. They used fraud and repression to cling to power all the way through World War I. Closer to home, think about Southern Democrats after the Civil War. Reconstruction, the 1860s and 1870s, brought widespread Black enfranchisement. African Americans back after the Civil War constituted an outright majority or a near majority in almost every post-Confederate state. So their enfranchisement terrified Southern Democrats and their supporters. Not only did Black suffrage threaten Southern Democrats' electoral dominance, but it threatened the entire racial order. Facing what they viewed as an existential threat, the Democrats played dirty. They, first of all, used violence and fraud to win back power, and then they used constitutional hardball to consolidate. So between 1885 and 1908, all 11 post-Confederate states passed laws that allowed the use of poll taxes, literacy tests, property and residency requirements to effectively eliminate African-American voting rights. So Black turnout in the South fell from 61% in 1880 to just 2% in 1912. Again, unwilling to lose, Southern Democrats stripped the right to vote from nearly half the population, ushering in nearly a century of authoritarian rule. Something similar is happening to the Republican Party today. The Republicans are a party primarily of white Christians, but white Christians are a rapidly declining share of the electorate. 1992, white Christians were more than 70% of the American electorate, an overwhelming majority. Today, they're about 50% and continuing to decline. That decline has triggered a fear among many Republicans that they're about to lose their electoral viability. As former Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann put it in the 2016 campaign, and I quote, she said, "This is the last election. It's a math problem of demographics and a changing United States. If you look at the numbers of people who vote and who lives in this country and who Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton want to bring into this country, this is the last election when we even have a chance to vote for somebody who will stand up for godly moral principles. This is it." But the problem isn't just that Republicans potentially face a bleak electoral future. It's that their base has come to view defeat as catastrophic. White Christians are not just any group. Just a few decades ago, when we were young, they occupied the top rung of all of our social, economic, political, and cultural hierarchy. They filled, you hear me okay? Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. 50 years ago, white Christians filled the presidency. They filled Congress. They filled the Supreme Court. They filled governor's mansions. They were the CEOs. They were the newscasters, the TV stars, the college professors. Those days are long gone, but losing one's dominant social status can be deeply threatening. Many Republican voters feel like they're on the brink, not just of losing elections, but losing their country. They feel like the country they grew up in is being taken away from them. The very idea of a white Christian America seems to be slipping away. That sense of loss has pushed many rank and file Republicans toward extremism. A poll from earlier this year, February of this year, found that 56% of Republicans agree with the statement that the traditional American way of life is disappearing so fast that we may have to use force to save it. 56%. Now, the Republicans' authoritarian turn would pose much less of a threat if the United States were like other democracies, where electoral majorities generally govern. As I noted earlier, a solid majority of Americans supports multiracial democracy. Most Americans embrace ethnic diversity. Most Americans embrace racial equality. Most Americans support legislation to expand voting rights. And most Americans have voted for the Democrats in 7 of the last 8 presidential elections. And yet America's new multiracial democratic majority has hurled itself against some of the world's most powerful counter-majoritarian institutions. Counter-majoritarian institutions are institutions that dilute the power of electoral majorities, either by preventing electoral majorities from gaining power in the first place, or by limiting the ability of governing majorities to exercise power. Now, some counter-majoritarian institutions are absolutely essential to democracy. In a modern liberal democracy, majorities have to be constrained in 2 ways. First of all, basic civil rights and civil liberties must be protected, roped off from the whims of the majority. And second, parties must be prevented from using their temporary majorities to entrench themselves in power, for example, by passing laws that undermine the opposition. So it's critical to have a Bill of Rights, to have an independent judiciary, to have a constitution that can't be easily manipulated by the majority. Those counter-majoritarian institutions are essential to democracy. But many counter-majoritarian institutions don't protect minority rights. They empower partisan minorities at the expense of the majority. They may allow partisan minorities to win power and govern in the face of opposition electoral majorities, or they may allow partisan minorities to permanently veto policy initiatives that are backed by the majority. They may allow partisan minorities to permanently veto policy initiatives backed by the majority. The United States has a bunch of nakedly counter-majoritarian institutions. These include the Electoral College, which allows losers of the popular vote to win power. It includes a severely malapportioned Senate which provides equal representation to all states regardless of population. It includes the Senate filibuster, which allows 41 senators to permanently block legislation backed by the majority. And it includes a powerful Supreme Court with lifetime tenure for Supreme Court justices, which allows justices appointed in one generation to thwart majorities for a generation and maybe two generations to follow. Now, Americans tend to think of these counter-majoritarian institutions as essential to democracy, but they're not. They are products of a pre-democratic era. By 18th century standards, the United States Constitution was pretty democratic. In fact, it was more democratic than every other constitution on earth. But over the last 2 centuries, over the last 200 years, other countries, other democracies have shed their pre-democratic institutions. Britain weakened the House of Lords and stripped it of its veto power. Denmark, Sweden, New Zealand, Portugal, Greece, Taiwan got rid of their undemocratic upper houses, their senates. Germany, Canada, Austria, Belgium democratized their senates by making them more proportional to the population. So like California, we get more senators than Wyoming. Germany, Portugal, Switzerland, and France imposed term limits on Supreme Court justices. The UK, Canada, Sweden, Denmark, Japan, New Zealand, Australia, Belgium, and Spain established a retirement age for justices. And every other presidential democracy on the face of the earth got rid of its electoral college. Argentina was the last one in 1994. So other democracies have become more democratic over the last century. They have eliminated 18th and 19th century institutions that allowed electoral minorities to thwart majorities. Only the United States has maintained most of its pre-democratic institutions intact. So the United States has become an outlier. We're the world's only presidential democracy with an electoral college. We have the most malapportioned Senate in the world, except for Argentina and Brazil. No other democracy has a filibuster that allows a congressional minority to permanently veto regular legislation backed by a majority. The United States is one of the only remaining democracies with lifetime appointments on the Supreme Court, and our Constitution is the world's hardest to change. So among democracies, the United States is uniquely counter-majoritarian. It is far more counter-majoritarian than Canada, than Australia, than the UK, than any democracy in Western Europe. Now, that may be a good thing. Maybe our institutions do a better job of protecting individual rights or preventing majority tyranny. But if you look at the most majoritarian states in the world, countries like Austria, Belgium, Finland, New Zealand, Denmark, Sweden, Portugal, Israel, most of them are thriving democracies. In fact, the two most majoritarian democracies in the world are New Zealand and Finland. If you look at the Freedom House Index, which measures the level of democratic freedom in every country in the world, New Zealand and Finland, the most majoritarian democracies on earth, get scores of 99 and 100 out of 100, respectively. Pretty good. They are the four most democratic countries on earth, along with Norway and Sweden, according to Freedom House. The United States gets a score of 83. It's okay. It's pretty good. Nowhere near as high as New Zealand and Finland. So you can get rid of nakedly counter-majoritarian institutions and still be a thriving democracy. In fact, the world's most thriving democracies are all much more majoritarian than the United States. But it's not just America's it's not just that America's counter-majoritarian institutions are not necessary for democracy. Increasingly, I want to argue they pose a threat to democracy. And this is new. Now, as you all know, the United States electoral system, our constitutional system, favors sparsely populated territories. The Electoral College is biased towards sparsely populated territories. The U.S. Senate is heavily biased towards sparsely populated territories. And because the Senate approves Supreme Court nominees, the Supreme Court is biased towards sparsely populated territories. Now, that rural bias has always existed as long as the Republic has existed. It's always been undemocratic. It's always been problematic for states like New York and California. But it's never had a partisan effect because for most of U.S. history, for 200 years, both major parties had urban wings and rural wings. So the system's rural bias never seriously advantaged one party over another. It is only in the early 21st century that our two parties have split along urban versus rural lines. Today, as you know, the Democrats are overwhelmingly based in the big metropolitan centers, while Republicans are overwhelmingly based in sparsely populated territory. That means that the Republicans have, through no fault of their own, have a systematic advantage in the Electoral College, in the Senate, and in the Supreme Court. That institutional bias allows the Republicans to win and to hold on to power without winning national majorities. In other words, our institutions are now skewing elections in favor of one party over another. So Republicans have won the popular vote, once in the last 20 years, yet they've controlled the presidency for 12 of the last 20 years. An electoral majority was not enough for the Democrats to win the presidency this year. Biden had to win by at least 4 points in order to win. It looks like he'll need to win by at least 4 points to be reelected in 2024. The Senate is similarly skewed. The Democrats consistently need to win the popular vote in the Senate by about 4 points to retain control of the Senate. That means if the Democrats consistently win, say 51.5% of the vote in the Senate, Republicans will consistently control the Senate. It takes 3 election cycles to renovate the Senate. You renovate 1/3 at each election. So it takes 3 cycles to fully renovate the Senate. The Democrats have won the overall popular vote in every 3-year cycle since 2000. And yet the Republicans controlled the Senate from 2015 to 2019. That means that in 2016, the Democrats won the popular vote for president and won the popular vote for the Senate. And yet Republicans won the presidency and both houses of Congress. That's minority rule. Minority rule has also skewed the composition of the Supreme Court. 4 of our 9 Supreme Court justices, Thomas, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Coney Barrett, were confirmed by senators who represented less than half the US population. And 3 of them, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, Coney Barrett, were nominated by a president who lost the popular vote and then confirmed by senators representing less than half the population. Again, this is minority rule. Now, minority rule is bad in and of itself, but it's made worse by the Republican Party's radicalization. Our counter-majoritarian institutions are not just empowering a minority party, they're empowering an authoritarian minority party. The combination of counter-majoritarianism and Republican authoritarianism has accelerated our democratic crisis. So the counter-majoritarian Electoral College gave Trump the presidency, and the counter-majoritarian Senate prevented or protected him from removal despite his effort to steal an election. The Senate has used the filibuster to block efforts to create an independent commission to investigate the January 6th insurrection, and it has blocked legislation. The Senate and the filibuster have blocked legislation to shore up voting rights and to protect the integrity of future elections. Likewise, the Supreme Court, another counter-majoritarian institution, has upheld Republican voter suppression measures and may well uphold Republican efforts to overturn future elections. So the rise of multiracial democracy has triggered an authoritarian reaction among a partisan minority. And instead of constraining Republican authoritarianism, our Constitution, unfortunately, has enabled it. Our Constitution was supposedly designed to protect us from majority, but tragically, it is failing to protect us from a dangerous minority. So what can we do? In the medium term, the United States desperately needs institutional reform. We need to entrench voting rights. We need to replace the Electoral College with direct presidential elections. We need to democratize the Senate. We need to eliminate the filibuster. We need to reform the Supreme Court. Much of that requires constitutional change. The idea that institutions drawn up in the 18th century are somehow sacred, that they are sort of by definition best practice across time and across all historical contexts, is both naive and terribly dangerous. Our constitutional system was designed by some very smart folks for a pre-democratic world without mass suffrage, without political parties. Our system worked reasonably well in a world of decentralized, undisciplined, non-ideological parties, like much of the 20th century. That system, the same system, does not work well in a context of extreme polarization and highly disciplined parties. And it may be fatal in a context where those parties are polarized along urban-rural lines. Other democracies change their constitutions with some frequency. In France, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Austria, Germany, the average lifespan of a constitution is between 15 and 99 years. In other words, constitutions endure for 1, 2, maybe 3 generations, and then they're reformed. The United States Constitution is exceedingly difficult to change, but we need to begin having a conversation about it. Our democracy may in fact depend on that. But that's not going to happen overnight. In the more immediate term, small d Democrats, anyone committed to defending democracy in the United States must build and sustain a broad coalition to defend democracy. That coalition has to extend from the AOC wing of the Democratic Party to the Liz Cheney wing of the Republican Party. It should be truly bipartisan. It should be inclusive of diverse and even opposing ideology. Until the anti-democratic forces that dominate the Republican Party are isolated and politically defeated, we cannot treat our elections as normal red versus blue affairs. When one party in a two-party system refuses to play by democratic rules, democracy is in serious, serious trouble. Authoritarian parties have to be isolated and have to be politically defeated. And the only way to do that, the only way to ensure that, is to forge a very broad multi-party coalition against it. So that coalition, that requires more than just sharing Lincoln Project ads on your Facebook. It requires sacrifice. It requires paying a political price. For conservatives, it requires at least temporarily leaving the party they spent their career in and working to elect a party they have spent their career opposing. No more Mitt Romney writing in his wife for president. He has to join the opposition and publicly align with Democrats. And for progressives, it means temporarily putting pretty cherished causes on the shelf so as to make space at the table for conservatives. It means swallowing hard and embracing Liz Cheney. You build coalitions with your rivals, not with your friends, not with your allies. And forging viable coalitions requires concession. It requires political sacrifice. It requires, in some cases, risking your political career. But that's what it takes to defend democracy. These are not ordinary times. If we behave as if these are ordinary times, if our politicians behave as if these are ordinary times, we will lose our democracy. As I noted at the outset, our democracy stands at a crossroads. There is no going back. America will either be a multiracial democracy in the 21st century, or it will not be a democracy. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn this over to Mara, who will moderate questions and answers. So, our question and answers. So please put your questions in the chat. Mara.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor Levitsky. And that was a lot to take in. We might want to reconvene in a week when people have had a chance to digest and come up with some new questions. So I think the question that's uppermost in a lot of people's minds is how can we stop the possibility of the theft of the 2024 election?
How do we stop it?
Yeah, I mean, or prevent it from happening, I guess we say.
I like to say that if I knew the answer to that question, I would have a much better paying job. Look, the first step, which is very important and which is beginning to happen, is public discussion. people need to be aware of it. We need to be talking about it. The media needs to be talking about it. The media needs to be reporting on it. And that's happening quite a bit. I mean, people are much more aware than they were just months ago of this possibility. Awareness makes a big difference. We can't get caught off guard. Secondly, this falls into the easy to say but difficult to do category, is there's some pretty decent legislation that we need to get through the Senate. First of all, the voting rights legislation, but secondly, the most recent iteration of the, I always get the names mixed up. Is it the I cannot remember the name of the legislation, but the most recent. So in Congress, the Democrats were caught off guard by these efforts to empower state legislatures to override or intervene the local election authorities and overturn results, or possibly to send alternate slates to the Electoral College. The Democrats have been focused for a decade. They've been focused for a long time on gerrymandering, on adjusting gerrymandering, and they've been focused on voter suppression for good reason. I mean, that's what Republicans have been doing over since 2010. There have been these efforts at the state level to restrict the vote. And so the initial For the People Act, HR 1, responded to the problems of the last decade. They basically fought the last war, but they were ill prepared to deal with an effort to overturn the results. Right? They dealt with ensuring access to registration, access to the ballot, but didn't deal with overturning the result. The last version of the bill, although I'm not an expert on this stuff, does begin to address this issue. So the key, though, is passing this legislation. I mean, the one thing that's terrifying, if you look back at history, at the outset of Jim Crow, when southern states were beginning to adopt the poll tax and residency and literacy requirements to wipe out African-American suffrage, there was a bill put forth in Congress called the Lodge Act that would have empowered the federal government to prevent that from happening. It would have empowered, I don't remember a lot of details of the bill, we're writing about it in the book, that would have essentially prevented things like adoption of the poll tax. And it had a majority. It had an overwhelming majority in the Congress. It had a majority in the Senate. It was blocked by a filibuster. And the Republicans kind of gave up because they were divided and decided they had other priorities. They had the 1890 version of the infrastructure bill, and they decided to sort of let it go. So it was stopped by a filibuster. They didn't pass the legislation. The Lodge Act ended up in the dustbin of history, and Jim Crow was consolidated for 80 years. I worry that we're in a fairly similar situation now. The legislation has passed the House. In theory, it's got the support of 50 senators. We're unwilling or unable to get rid of the filibuster, and the bill may die.
How can we counteract the misinformation that's just rife right now about, especially on the internet, about our political situation? You know, some of it's outright lies, some of it's distortions, you know, kind of half-truths. Is there any way that we can, and that seems to be driving a lot of people's beliefs?
Yeah. Again, if I had the answer to this question, I'd be winning a prize somewhere. These are tough questions, guys. To some extent, we cannot. To some extent, misinformation is being driven by demand for misinformation, which is a product of polarization. This is not the first time that Americans have been polarized into two different camps and gotten their own information. Obviously, it's all sort of magnified by the existence of social media. But there have been other times in history, both in the United States and in other countries, where you have highly polarized left and right wing groups reading their own newspapers, participating in their own clubs, talking to each other, feeding each other their own information. And it's problematic, but honestly, I believe that the most important problem is the polarization and not the media. The media and misinformation are reflecting polarization. That said, other European countries have gone much further, and we've begun to do this. Twitter at least has begun to self-regulate. But European democracies do a much, I think, better job of regulating misinformation in social media than the U.S. We have a very sort of free market, freedom of expression oriented culture, and the idea of regulating speech is always a very difficult one in the United States. And so we've been slow as a society to regulate. And particularly the poor regulation, both government regulation and self-regulation of Facebook has been dangerous to democracy. It's killed countless number of people because of misinformation about COVID and vaccines. It's a serious problem. So I'm not an expert on how to regulate social media, but I do know that there exist examples across Europe of how democracies can do it in a way that doesn't violate basic civil rights.
You mentioned towards the end of your talk that about building a coalition, reaching out to not just your allies, but to those who are theoretically disagree with you. And one of the questions was posed about that, is it possible, do you think it's going to be possible to attract at least some of the GOP grassroots, so the non-politicians, the voters, to support a coalition to save democracy?
It is possible to attract some, and that's all you need. Pew just came out with a report where it divided the U.S. electorate into, I can't remember, it's 7 or 8 or 9 tribes, and each party had a sort of a category, and basically 30-ish% of the electorate is hardcore Trumpist, and there's no way that AOC running around campaigning with Mitt Romney is going to win those guys over. They hate Mitt Romney too. But there is a roughly 10, maybe even 15% of the electorate. Actually, there are two groups that this coalition can attract. One is purely independents. There's really only 10-ish% of the electorate that really belong to neither party and can go either way. Those folks have to be attracted. And then there are about 10% of the electorate that is Republican but anti-Trump, and that has had an upset stomach for the last 4 years, but really hated Hillary Clinton, and just in most cases could not get itself to vote, to pull the lever for the Democrats. So maybe they didn't vote, or maybe they wrote in somebody, maybe they wrote in Ronald Reagan, but they couldn't bring themselves to vote for the Democrats. We're not talking about 30, 40% of the electorate. We're talking about a sliver, 10% of the electorate. That's enough to assure that that authoritarian forces get defeated in the election. All you need is that 10% and a public, formal, clear, in-your-face coalition that's not just the Democratic Party, it's not just the blue and the donkey, but a coalition that includes right-wing people that liberals do not like and disagree with, that will send a message, a signal to voters that this is not an ordinary election. This is not just an ordinary election where you can talk about the Democrats in disarray and the Republicans are the party of the parents. No, it has to be a Democratic coalition against the authoritarian. And that work has not been done by either side yet, neither liberals nor conservatives.
So we're getting very close to the end, and we always like to wrap up with a question about what we can do to help preserve our democracy. Some of us, we're all presumably voters. Some of us are league members. I'm sure many are active in other organizations. What can we do?
Let me first say, because maybe you don't get told it enough, is how much you guys have done to save our democracy so far. Things could have ended up a lot worse in the last 4 years than they did. the removal of a demagogue from the presidency in 2020 didn't solve our problem. But I can assure you we would be much, much worse off if we hadn't done that. Preserving our democracy, allowing our democracy to muddle through over the last 4 years was a monumental achievement. And it was done by grassroots activists. It was done by citizens in organizations like the League of Women Voters and many others that have been out there defending democracy for the last 4 years in a multitude of ways. So I always tell people, as depressing as my talk just was, I'm actually much more optimistic than many of my colleagues in this sort of burgeoning industry of, the sky is falling, democracy is dying. I actually think we stand a good chance of surviving this, and in large part because of the strength of the opposition, of the small d democratic opposition in the United States. We are much different from Russia and Turkey and Venezuela and Hungary because we have a strong, well-organized, electorally viable, well-financed, quite honestly, opposition. And that gives us a fighting chance. So we got to keep fighting. And it means obviously, maybe not obviously, but not an interesting answer. We've got to do everything possible to get the electoral and voting rights legislation through Congress. And we have to do everything possible to mobilize people to vote in the next election, particularly in states where which is not necessarily Maryland, but particularly in states where access to registration and access to the ballot is now being challenged. One of my pet ideas is I think we need a new Freedom Summer. We need to mobilize young people to go down to states where voting rights are imperiled and register people. I think that's not only will it help register people, but that will help create citizens. I mean, the generation of kids who participated in the Freedom Summer and similar activism in the 1960s became democratic superheroes. They became great citizens. And I think that unfortunately, as we said at the outset, the fact that you guys once again have to prioritize voting rights it's very depressing. It's too bad that we're there, but we're there. And so you guys should do what you guys do. Register people to vote.
Thank you very much. I'll turn it back over to Gail.